Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. I'm Sarah Foyer, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's virtual forum, policy forum this morning, where we're going to be exploring popular protest, some democratic prospects, and policy dilemmas for the Biden administration across the Middle East and North Africa. We had a few motivations for this event today. The first one is the Biden administration's upcoming Summit for Democracy, which will take place next month, early next month. Now, in that summit, the Middle East and North Africa will not be very prominently represented. And it's sort of perhaps a telling moment about democratic prospects in the region more generally. And indeed, what we've seen in the last couple of months is at least two Arab states, Tunisia and Sudan, which had been going through very different, although in some ways equally promising democratic transitions, undergo some real difficulties there and some backsliding on that front. And so we wanted to sort of take a step back and assess the trajectories of these states. The other motivation, though, was an observation that notwithstanding the lack of perhaps major democratic breakthroughs in the region over the last decade or so, what we have seen is a kind of new normal set in of persistent, even if at times low-level protests across the region, because citizens continue to demand things like jobs, housing, better governance, free expression, human rights, and so on. And so these two realities, I think, are likely to be with us for some time. And they raise a lot of questions and I think policy dilemmas for the US administration, as well as for other Western countries who are looking to build constructive ties with countries in the region. So to help unpack some of these questions today, I'm joined by three terrific speakers. We're going to hear from Chiraz Arbi. Chiraz is a Tunisian political analyst and a regional consultant for UN Women. For the last decade, Chiraz has been providing technical assistance to Tunisia's political parties, candidates, and parliamentary blocs. She also worked for several years for the Tunis office of the National Democratic-Institute. Welcome, Chiraz. Then I'm going to turn to Yasir Zaidan. Yasir is a part-time lecturer at National University-Sudan, and he's a doctoral student at the University of Washington, where his research has been focusing on political transitions in the Red Sea region and Middle Eastern countries' involvement in the Horn of Africa more generally. Great to have you with us, Yasir. And finally, I'm going to turn to Alberto Fernandez, Vice President of the Middle East Media Research Institute. Previously, Alberto served as president of the Middle East Broadcasting Networks. He was also the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires in Sudan from 2007 to 2009. And he was the State Department's coordinator for strategic counterterrorism communications, among other senior positions in Washington and throughout the Middle East and Africa. So before I turn to Chiraz to get us started, just a note to our attendees online. If you are joining us through Zoom and you would like to submit a question to our speakers, feel free to just use the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you are joining us either on YouTube or on our website where we're streaming this event live, you can send your questions to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. That's policyforum as one word together at washingtoninstitute.org. Okay, so Chiraz, I'd like to start with you and turn to the Tunisian story for a few moments. I think that some observers of what has been going on in Tunisia these last few months have been a bit puzzled by the ostensibly high level of public support for what President Kais Saied, the steps that he took beginning in July to essentially freeze parliament and seemingly sort of take charge of most of the levers of political power in the country. I mean, even some of the leading NGOs in Tunisia seemed sort of reluctant to condemn the move outright. And so we've seen a kind of interesting evolution in the public stance on what Kais Saied has been trying to do. So first, I want to ask you about this question of the public. Where is the Tunisian public today? Are we beginning to see mobilization in a different way that maybe we haven't seen in the last few months? Many of the polls, for what they're worth, that have come out have suggested that the Tunisian public is quite divided on this. But I'm curious, you're on the ground there. How do you see the place of the Tunisian public today?
Thank you, Sarah, for having me. I'm happy to be with you in this panel. So actually, in order to understand the reaction or the positions of the public, there are two defining moments. The first moment is July 25. And I think July 25 did not come out of nothing because, of course, the Tunisia's transition in comparison to other Arab and Middle Eastern countries have made huge progress in terms of liberties, freedoms, institutional reforms, public reforms. Yet the socioeconomic level and the socioeconomic sector was missing. So there is kind of the transition have only targeted the human rights and political change, but did not touch anything related to the socioeconomic, which are representing the essential needs of the revolution. And so if we can say in a word, democracy did not deliver. So that's why the July 25 decision to suspend the parliament was met with the huge welcome from the public. People, independently of their political affiliation, were happy to see the parliament because they see the parliament as the face of democracy. And even though the parliament is not the sole responsible for socioeconomic reforms, for average Tunisians, the parliament, as it is representative and as it is the first democratically elected national body, it needs its responsibility is to respond to citizens' needs and demands. The parliament have become in the last 4 years a space for conflict, especially that is aired live. And I think here the decision to air all the discussion of the parliament live, with all the conflict, the debates, etc., did not participate in creating a positive perception. And so people were, you can go to with a taxi driver and say, enough with this parliament, the people there are not representative, the policies are not responding to Tunisian needs. So that was the first instance, the July 25, where people were really happy to see the parliament dissolved. But then there was another instance, decisive moment, which is the 22 September decree, presidential decree, so the 117 decree. In this decree, so the president, he suspended the constitution. He just maintained the chapter on freedoms and liberties, and he suspended all the other chapters of the constitution, and he said in this decree that there's going to be reforms that will touch all parts of the government, and that there is no judicial review possible for any of these reforms. So here we enter into a dictatorial based on exceptional measures, and people were waiting for a timeline that will define this exceptional period, but also we're waiting for answers on his action plan to face or to respond to the socioeconomic needs. But again, he was still in the political reforms. He said that his plan is to change the political, to enact political reforms that will change the regime from semi-presidential to presidential, that he will change even the way the representativity. So for him, representative democracy is not efficient and has failed, and we need to move to direct democracy. People don't know, we don't have a clear image here in Tunisia on what does it mean, the project of the president pertaining to direct democracy. He's still top on the surveys, but from September 22, the second defining moment, there started to be a lot of interrogations and questions on to what degree the president has in fact a project, to what degree this project can respond to Tunisia's real challenges, and to what degree what he's putting through the decree is not presenting alternative forms of dictatorship that are covered in citizens' needs, or in direct democracy model that no one have a clear idea on what it is. And so the public has been, there is no one public also, there is, needs to be said. So there are protests, but also he's still top on the surveys. And if you talk to an average citizen, most of the people are for no return to the democratic parliamentary or the democratic the parliamentary democracy in the previous parliament, but they are for also, they are not neither for the continuation of this exceptional measures. And every day that goes by, and this is what we say here in Tunisia, is going in the counter direction that people hoped for on July 25. On July 25, people hoped for a change that will really touch their daily lives. But again, the president's speech is totally incoherent or unmatching what the average citizen is hoping for. So this, let's say, this connection between the president's project and people's needs is creating a confidence gap in his presidency. There is also the new, people, with the arrival of the new government, they were hoping that this will be a new start that will change things. But again, the government is really seems to be only on paper. It's the only spokesperson and the only decision maker is the president. So there is really a lot of questions about his intentions, his project, about also the future of Tunisia amid a crisis, a socioeconomic crisis. In the 2022 national budget, we have a lot of deficit, and the president is disconnecting himself from international relations, from international donors, and also he's disconnecting himself from political actors, from all the let's say the usual suspects in Tunisia that are here and that called the president to assist him or to work together. And this is one of the things that everyone is talking. Two things: to have an action plan, but also that is participatory, to have a participatory approach, to have a transparency, to have a communication plan, but also that he, as a president, he does not have the right to make all these reforms on himself in isolation with civic and political actors.
So Chiraz, let me ask you. I mean, this is really interesting, your assessment here. First of all, just a minor comment, but the what you mentioned earlier about this sort of unintended consequence of suddenly Tunisia had eyes on their legislature. This was something, of course, that was new. This had not happened before 2011. But in a way, what I hear you saying is that having that transparency facilitated in a sense, because it fed a lot of people's discomfort, disdain even for their elected parliament. It actually ended up, I think, in an unintended way, facilitating what is by most accounts a sort of anti-democratic series of measures. So that's just a sort of interesting paradox that I wanted to pull out. But let me ask you, before we turn to the Sudanese case, and of course these cases are quite different, and we're trying here today to use these cases in a sense to get at some of the broader questions. But I want to ask you one more thing about the Tunisian trajectory here. I mean, where do you see this going now? I mean, it seems, at least from the outside, that Tunisia is essentially settling into a kind of one-man show here. I don't know, but perhaps you could point to for us to a few, where are the checks on his power at this point? And all of the civil society actors in Tunisia, which for the last decade, when those of us who were trying to analyze the Tunisian story in the last 10 years, as you said, the political track, civil society, these were sort of bright spots because there seemed to be a real thriving civil society with organizations, watchdogs, and so on. Are they able to serve as a kind of check at this point against a more concentrated, a greater concentration of power? Or are we basically going to see Tunisia sort of fall into the kind of familiar kind of one man or one party show that we see in a number of states in the region?
So civil society actors and associations, and even the union, which is very active in society and has a huge influence, are being vocal. And as I said, since the second defining moment, since the 117 decree, are being vocal and are expressing their frustration and their refusal for the president to have this one-man show, and that all reforms needs to be discussed and needs to be inclusive and participatory. And in the media now, also the demonstrations and in the streets are all different expressions of people that are influenced, NGOs, etc., that are really not accepting this process and this methodology. Now, to what degree they are influential, let's say that before there were more spaces for influence. Now it's really between the president and the citizens, and the intermediary actors, meaning political parties and civil society, have a second role. And this is also due to the perceptions when the Tunisians have direct dialogue with the presidents, we as civil society also, we are wondering to what degree we are influential, what was our weight during this 10 years, so that citizens don't feel the need to communicate through us and are content with this direct dialogue. Political parties have contributed to this lack of confidence that citizens have for political party, because there are a lot of corruption, there are a lot of political figures that are really have cases, judiciary cases, and this has led to this misconfidence between the political elite, let's say, and average citizens. And the president have this charisma to average citizens to connect with them directly and to say that the intermediary organs are not necessary, and that I'm talking to citizens directly and there is no need for any intermediary. And actually he's launching a national dialogue that he says it's with the people. I'm going to have a national dialogue with the people. And we have been asking, what does it mean, the people? And political parties and civil societies are representative of the people. They are means of association of the people. But really, so far, there is this disconnection, and we don't see any communication from the president to really interact with the civic actors, political actors, even with the union, the National Union, trade union that has been supporting the president, but are now really criticizing the approach and the process the president has taken. And so really going forward, we don't know exactly, we are waiting for the decrees on the reforms, and we'll see to what degree we can influence and contribute to these reforms.
Right. Thanks very much, Chiraz. Very interesting. And we'll come back to you when we open it up for discussion. So Yasir Zaidan, I want to turn to what's been happening in Sudan. Of course, a very different story there. I mean, for one thing, the transition in Sudan is much newer. It's much fresher. This really, what we're looking at now only goes back to about 2019. And usually the crisis in Sudan is portrayed as essentially a power struggle between the military and the civilian leadership. That this, of course, came out of this power sharing agreement that was struck last year. Is that really the best framework to understand what's going on over there? Are we missing something else here?
Thank you, Sarah. It's nice to be here. I'm delighted to be back virtually at the Washington Institute. To answer your question, I will explore some unseen elements of Sudan's military takeover that happened on October 25th. First of all, I argue against that dominant narrative of a contest between the military and the civilians. I think there is more complex picture here. The first factor or the element that I would like to explore is the incompetence of the civilian side. And I will explain this in different points. The first is that the FFC, which is the Freedom Forces, sorry, the Freedom Forces for Change, led the protest, and it was a historical alliance that, in first time in Sudan's history, to bring all of these political parties, and they were successful in leading the protest, and they had a shared objective to remove al-Bashir, but they've been very unsuccessful in governing or in creating transitional or forming transitional institutions. For example, the transitional parliament that was supposed to be appointed mainly by the FFC on January of 2020 has been delayed continuously. 2 months before the military takeover, Prime Minister Hamdok called for the formation of the body after continuous delay. And other also institutional vacuum. For example, the judiciary institutions are still not working. There is no constitutional court in Sudan. The head of the Chief Justice has been removed, and the position has been vacant for a couple of months. And also in terms of like participatory participation, the municipalities rule has not been approved, and that also led to some kind of parties domination of the scene. And that's one of the elements that I think has been overlooked. One of the second element is also the Juba Peace Agreement, which I think has exacerbated a tribal center divide because of the Juba Peace Agreement invited rebel groups from Darfur and Southern Sudan. However, that peace agreement sidelined a tribal faction in Eastern Sudan. And that led to a protest in Port Sudan, which is the main terminal port in Sudan. And also portrayed the central governance as a very kind of urban government rather than like a national government that includes all kind of rural institutions, such as the tribal institutions. The final element, I think, is also the political parties themselves. They employed a rent-seeking behavior by prioritizing partisan interests, so employing their allies and party members in government positions in different levels, and that led to a perception that political parties are there for power mainly, not for like creating institutions to transition to a democracy.
Very interesting. Thank you. You know, it's fascinating because these are, as you said, these are, I think, elements of the story that we don't hear as much about, at least here in the West. I want to ask you now a similar question to what I asked Chiraz about the public in Sudan. I mean, you know, it seemed that I suppose in contrast to what we saw in response to Kais Saied's move in Tunisia, in Sudan, the public seemed to be broadly opposed to the military's recent, whatever we want to call it, attempted coup. And so I wonder, you know, but on the other hand, what you just pointed to suggests that actually the civilian leadership may have also been giving folks a reason to be losing faith in the civilian side's ability to govern. And so I wonder today, how do you assess the position of the public in Sudan? And when it comes to their ability to be a real sort of political actor here, where are they today?
Yes, this is a great question. And I think this is the bright side of what's happening in Sudan, is that the public on the ground are very active. Many protests have been going in the last 2 weeks or like the last months. Today was also like a big protest and there was a big protest in Khartoum that is happening right now. So the public, in terms of the young people on the ground, they are very we're actively against the coup, but it's also, I think they are lacking that organization that removed Bashir, because as you said, they lost faith on the FFC, the political parties, and they are mainly apolitical younger activists. So in my opinion, this movement should go forward and try to create a wide political umbrella. They should have a political kind of project that includes the FFC, but also other political actors, such as the tribal actors in the peripheries and in the rural areas. And because of the wider the coalition, the wider the civilian coalition, I think the better to balance the military power in Sudan's political map.
You know, one of the arguments that have been made in the last decade is when you look around the region, even if we can't really point to wildly successful democratic transitions out of the Arab Spring, there is an argument that something fundamentally did change coming out of those events. And that is that the leaders today in the region, I think, are more aware, they're more conscious of, and the publics are as well, they're conscious of the ability of publics to be a real pressure point on these governments and on these regimes, so that even if reforms come gradually or not at all in some cases, there was a shift in the mindset about the potential role of the public. I wonder, in Sudan, from what you can tell anyway, does the governing authorities today, on both the military and the civilian sides, Do you see that to be the case in Sudan, that whatever happens, they know that the public can play a role, or is the situation such that the public is not really much of a factor from their point of view?
Yes, I think the governing elements in Sudan now, they understand very strongly that the public has a role to play and actually influencing events in Sudan. So without that continuous protest after the October 25th military takeover or military coup, I think the political agreement between Hamdok, the prime minister, and the military would never have been possible. And I think with the Hamdok's also initiative to bring or invite elements of the resistance committee, neighborhoods resistance committee, to his office and to have a dialogue with them is a proof that the people in the street, they will have a role to play in the coming days of Sudan's transition, especially with the election that is expected to be in July 2023.
Great. Thanks very much, Yasir. Very interesting. So I want to turn now to Alberto Fernandez and try and broach the subject of US policy having to do with all of this, because of course there are serious policy implications for Washington when we see, for example, protests erupt in countries such as the ones we've been discussing, but also more generally across the region. And there are policy dilemmas, I think, for Washington when they see for example, some of the democratic backsliding that we've seen in the last few months. So my first question for you is, I mean, you served in government, including in Khartoum, actually, but I actually want to ask you more about your time in Washington. You know, can you speak a little bit about, you know, what are some of the dilemmas that face? It's easy for us sort of on the outside to criticize the US government for either doing too much or too little, but can you just walk us through a little bit some of the dilemmas that policymakers really face when they see, for example, new protests erupting, or on the other hand, an attempted, what we saw in Sudan, for example, in the form of an attempted coup, it seems.
Sure. It's first of all, I'm delighted to be here and to be listening to and learning from, certainly from Chiraz and from my friend Yasir, and it's always good to hear from people close to the ground. You know, in Washington, when it comes to all these situations, the policy process is complicated because there's never, for any country, no matter how small, no matter how insignificant, and Tunisia and Sudan are significant countries, there's not a one agenda policy. There are always other things on the table. I mean, to give you an example, when I was in Sudan, when I was in Khartoum, the main policy directive of the U.S. government at the time was the protection and the implementation of the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Accords, between Bashir's party, the NCP, and Southerners of the SPLM. Everything else was secondary or tertiary, you know, was a kind of a priority list of things. And so when you look at Sudan, when you look at Tunisia, you know, there's a policy process that goes on which involves multiple factors. And there are, you know, bilateral issues and regional issues and things related to what else is happening in the region. Think about it. The U.S. diplomat, Jeffrey Feltman, who negotiated or worked on the deal after the coup or before the coup and after the coup in Sudan, is also the point person for Ethiopia, where we have genocide and civil war occurring. So he has to kind of try to put everything back together in Sudan. And he also had to deal with this, you know, much more bloody issue occurring next door. So what I mean is there are always trade-offs that have to happen. So it's very easy, and we see this constantly with activists, well-intentioned people, you know, who say, you know, focus on us, look at our thing. There are people dying on the street. And that's true, but whether that street is in Sudan or in Iraq, as we saw from 29, for several years, the demonstrators being killed by government forces and militias in Iraq, Washington has other issues as well. It doesn't mean that they don't care about democratic processes or they don't care about people on the street, but there are lots of things that are being worked on. And this is especially, I think, salient and significant when you have, as you have in Sudan, and Yasir is right to mention it, you have a very legitimate process in the street of people rallying. You have hundreds of thousands of people in Sudan today, and they're demanding, an end to this partnership of blood, that they're calling it, between the military and Hamdok. But actually, it's not clear there's no real leadership in a way. There's no real kind of agenda. It's a kind of a negative, we're against this thing, which is a bad thing, and we want it to stop, and we want it to be changed, but it's not clear what that leads to, absent a kind of a clear political framework. You can have very well-intentioned people on the street in any of these Arab capitals, and it's all too often easy for Washington to write them off or to say, yeah, they're significant, but I need to talk to the people who are in power because I have these 6 different issues which are important for me to work on, whether counterterrorism or migration or regional peace, etc.
That's very interesting. So actually what I hear you saying is that, well, I'll ask it of you rather than put words in your mouth. Is it the case, because one of the things that we have seen in a number of these protest movements across the region, so whether it was, in the most recent iteration, perhaps in Algeria starting in 2019, we've seen it to some extent in Sudan, even in Tunisia more recently, and in places such as Lebanon, even Iraq to some extent, that the protest movements have often, first of all, they have remained largely leaderless. And second, at times they've been at pains to really outline concrete steps. Does that affect the ability of Washington to respond, or is it, because what I hear you saying is that the absence of sort of clear plans may make it difficult for the U.S. For U.S. policymakers to essentially know what address to glom onto. Is that the case?
Yeah, to a certain extent, exactly. So, for example, the masses that bravely came out in Sudan after October 25th to challenge the military coup that happened, one of their demands was the return of Prime Minister Hamdok back to his position, which eventually happened. But the Americans, the international community, were they talking to the masses in the street? Which masses would they be talking to? No, they were talking to Hamdok and to others who have their own agenda, who have their own, worldview. And of course, what you have happened in Sudan, and this goes to your point of what's happening regionally, of course, is that there is people power, for example, in Sudan. But there is also an attempt by the regime, the military regime, and by the former regime, the Bashir regime, to play the people card as well. So, for example, Yasir mentioned the protests in East Sudan that occurred, and he mentioned the Juba peace agreement and the rebel groups there. He had a very interesting thing happen. Some of the rebel groups who had negotiated a peace accord with Sudan supported the military coup. They're part of the military coup process. And as for the demonstrators in East Sudan, they wanted a fall of the civilian government and they wanted a military government. So you actually had the military manipulating, giving the appearance of they have their own people in the street. The numbers are much smaller, compared to the people who want or against military rule is much bigger. But that goes to your thing about how regimes have to recognize that things have changed.
Right.
The generals in Sudan, they launched the coup and they said they did it for the sake of the democratic transition and the elections and the revolution. So they clothed themselves in the language of revolution as they subverted that very same revolution.
Right. So I want to ask you now about the U.S. Response in both of these cases, and perhaps we can broaden it out a bit more, because the responses were interesting and they were quite different. I mean, when Kais Saied took this step on July 25th, I think initially the Biden administration sort of wanted to see where this was going, and it eventually put out very clear statements that there was a hope and an expectation that the country would return to a democratic process, that parliament would be reinstated, and so on. Or at the very least, that Said would appoint a new prime minister, as he had promised to do. But generally speaking, I think the response to what has happened in Tunisia has arguably been a bit milder than what we saw in the Sudanese case, where very quickly there was discussion of, hold on a second, all of the assistance that was going to be flowing to Sudan, now we're going to have to consider cutting all of this. Yeah. So can you, I mean, when I saw these sort of different responses, I immediately thought of actually this issue of the public that we were talking about earlier, because yes, I imagine that it's not very easy for an American administration, if they see, even if it's ostensibly an instance of democratic backsliding, but if it's something that seems to be supported by much of the public, how can Washington then come in and start saying, well, we don't support this, or we are deeply concerned about this, when at least half the Tunisian population seems to be behind it? Whereas in the Sudanese case, it seemed anyway that there was a clearer opposition, there was a groundswell of opposition to Burhan's move to take over. And so perhaps it made it a bit easier for Washington to then, go forward with what it would have wanted to say anyway. How do you assess that?
Well, of course, first of all, the temptation for any American administration is to deal with the status quo. There's a kind of temptation, there's a kind of leaning towards accepting things as they are. Look what we saw Brett McGurk, the administration's point man, say only a few days ago about how the U.S. needs to get back to basics and against regime change. I mean, some interpret that within the context of Iran, but others are saying, well, basically what it means is the Americans are, as a result of kind of a policy of disengagement or distancing themselves from events on the region, are going to kind of deal with things as they are. So if generals are in charge, they're going to deal with it. If some other person is in charge, they're going to deal with it. The big difference between the two cases that you mentioned is Sudan was in a transition, or is in a transition. But Kais Saied was democratically elected. He was democratically elected with 72% of the vote. So the fact that he's now behaving in an authoritarian manner, you could say he falls into that category of popular or democratically credentialed authoritarians. That gives them a certain amount of clout and a certain amount of credibility in Washington that even if people don't like it, they're going to accept. Meanwhile, in Sudan, you have generals who, by the way, are products of the Bashir regime, a 30-year Islamist dictatorship. And one of the first things they do after overthrowing the government is release Bashir regime people from prison, only to realize they have to imprison them and put them back because it's embarrassing. So it's very easy for Washington to say, Tunisia, the president, we don't like what he did, but he's a democratically elected president. How are we going to deal with this? Whereas in Sudan, you say, these are Bashir regime thugs bringing back a kind of NCP-light regime and clothing it in the language of revolution. So it's very easy to kind of make those, kind of snap judgments. There's a certain logic behind it.
Okay. One last question for you in this round from me anyway, and that has to do with the general ability of the United States to really have an impact on the direction of transitions such as the ones that we've seen in Sudan and Tunisia. I mean, what happened in Sudan, I think it was the day after Jeff Feltman was in the country. I mean, and that the military did this, it didn't speak very well to, there was a statement in there, it seemed, about the ability of Washington to even influence. And yet, when developments unfolded, it did seem that the country was responsive ultimately to the pressures that the U.S. and others, I think, brought to bear. So, more generally today, how do you assess Washington's ability to even have much influence on these countries, and where would you, looking forward now? We know that the Biden administration has prioritized the matter of human rights, democracy perhaps less so, but still there is going to be this democracy summit next month, I think, to try and bring some attention to the matter. So moving forward, I mean, would you have suggestions for the administration in its approach more generally to the region on these issues?
Oh, has the administration prioritized human rights, or has it said that it prioritized human rights? I would say that it said that it prioritized human rights. And as for democracy being at the center of its of American policy, it's more like the center of a donut more than anything else. There's a golden opportunity coming up with the Democracy Summit. There's some talk in Washington that with the Democracy Summit, which is a kind of carrot in a way, but there's going to be a kind of a stick, that there's going to be additional Magnitsky sanctioning of individuals worldwide, perhaps, who are problematic. And so the U.S. has a lot of tools, but the challenge always is that you can have tools in the hypothetical, but how far are you really going to go? Especially if what you want is status quo stability, as what it seems that this is what the Biden administration wants. They want to pivot to climate change, pivot to China. The Middle Eastern region is too problematic, so they kind of would like to wash their hands and move on. Well, people in the region read the American media, so they know about this hesitancy in Washington. They know about this kind of sense of disengagement, whether it's not actually on the ground. They know that Washington has changed. I mean, when I was in Sudan, there were people in the administration talking about going to war over Darfur. It never happened. It didn't even get into the planning stage, but there were people who actually thought of things like this. It's inconceivable that something like that would happen today. Thank God, I would say, we've had enough experience in wars. So people in the region, regimes in the region realize, they pick up on it. Their sense is America is tired, America is overextended, America is distracted. That leads them to make certain decisions, to take certain decisions. And I think the fact that they launched the coup the day after Jeffrey Feltman was there is evidence that they thought that they were going to pay a price, but maybe it was a price that they could support.
Right. Great. Thanks very much, Alberto. So just a reminder to viewers that if you have questions and you're watching on Zoom, if you could just submit them using the chat function. And if you're watching on YouTube or on our website, please send an email to policyforum@washingtoninstitute.org. We're starting to get questions coming in, but I want to ask Chiraz and Yasir to just weigh in on this last point that Alberto made concerning the perceptions of the U.S. in the region. In other words, the perception on the part of people in the region today, what do they see as the potential role for the United States? I mean, here in these two cases that we've been discussing today, these are, Tunisia has received a tremendous amount of support from the US government in the last decade. And I think in the Sudanese case as well, once 2019 happened and Washington saw what was starting to unfold, I think Sudan has really been seen as a potential opportunity here. And there are other countries in the region as well, where the US has identified friendly governments, or at least governments that it would like to develop a friendlier relations with. But from the standpoint of people in the region today, how do you see the role of the United States? Does Washington have a say in any of this, or should they just not even touch this with a 10-foot pole, as we say? Chiraz, why don't you start, and then I'll ask Yasir to weigh in.
I think from the Tunisian perspective that US support is important, but also how it is perceived. It is perceived that it should also be aligned with what the citizens and what the Tunisians want. And what the Tunisians want is not less democratic or less democratizations, but more democratization that really hasn't. They can see the impact of democratization on their daily lives, on changes. And I think that's what is the perception that the US and international partners in general, but the US in particular, should continue the support, but should also be developed, and also not to react solely to decisions or to, it was seen, I think, positively that after the 25th of July, the US did not qualify Kais Said's decision as a coup. And I think it was appreciated, because it is true that Tunisia has made a lot of achievements, but it is also seen right now as a moment to correct the democratic trajectory. It's not to remove it. It's not to move back to dictatorship. I think that this generation of Tunisians are not willing to remove or any democratic achievements, liberty of freedom, liberty of association, etc., freedom of press. These are achievements that should not be removed. And I think moving more to the fact that democracy should deliver socioeconomically, this is, I think, the thing that failed to be done over the 10 past years. And let me tell you something about this, that in 2018, there is a huge awaited piece of legislation, which is the decentralization law, that through it, Tunisians expected that in moving to a decentralized form of government, there's going to be a real local development and a real local and regional share of wealth. This did not happen. After 3 years, the municipal councils became a space for political disputes and debates, and again, they created another layer of frustration. So just to give the perspective why Tunisians were happy with this move, because they were everyone in Tunisia were kind of waiting for a moment of disconnection with what happened, and a renewal, but without moving from the democratic ideals. So just to finish, what Tunisians are waiting, that there is an understanding at the international level, but also at the national level, as you said, Tunisia, like the civil society and the NGOs, and they are safeguards and they are watchdog that continue to do their role, and they will be very, very, they are doing their monitoring, and there is no way that any violation of human rights or any attentive of authoritative move that will be tolerated on the let's say on the long term. So here everyone is vigilant and waiting to see Kais Said's reforms, so that they can commented, and that they can really participate in the elaboration of what's the future of Tunisia in terms of the big reforms at the national and local level.
Great, thank you, Chiraz. Yasir, do you have a view on this question about U.S. Influence or what it should be or could be?
Yes, I think the U.S. response to the military takeover in Sudan was unique, and I think it was successful. This time it was very interesting that the U.S. coordinated its response with regional countries such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, and Egypt, and vis-a-vis Sudan's issue. And that, I think, also solidified the U.S. pressure onto the military. But also it's very pragmatic of the U.S. also to think that the military has a role in Sudan's transition. And I think that's a very fact that was clear when the protest happened in 2019, is that you need elements of the previous regime security to side with the protest, because you want to keep that kind of like structure of the state. You don't want to go on a track of civil war, especially that now rebel groups, as Alberto mentioned, are more allied with the military. So I think the U.S. Pragmatic and multilateral response was really successful in restoring Hamdok's back in the prime minister office. And I think it could play a more a destructive and positive role in the future by helping the formation of transitional institutions, the Constitutional Committee, the Elections Committee, in the future. The people's perception of the U.S. has always been that, even on the eve of the military takeover, is that the U.S. should intervene, the U.S. should put sanctions, and I think the power of social media have actually also played a role in that, and we've seen many policymakers from the U.S. administration being very vocal about the need to end the current kind of military takeover. There was some kind of disappointment when the Troika, or the US, UK, and Norway and the EU actually supported the political agreement between Hamdok and the military. But as Alberto mentioned, the policy making is not as simple. It has many complex elements of it. And with more engagement between the US and Sudan's people, especially like on training programs and democratization programs, I think that could really help the way forward on Sudan's transition.
Great, thank you. So in the final remaining minutes here, I want to just relay a question that came in from our audience, and it has to do with the relationship between political progress and economic growth. The question that came in had more to do specifically with the Tunisian case, where for many years, I think, those of us who were watching Tunisia tended to say, well, the political track seems to be going pretty well. The economy is another question, and we have to look out for this, because people are going to start potentially associating democratic institutions with poor economic performance and poor governance. And to some extent, I think that is probably what has happened in Tunisia. But more generally in the region, I think that we are seeing now, and if you add to what has happened, the COVID pandemic and the economic hardships that the pandemic has wrought across the region, should we be more focused today on questions of governance, of economic opportunity, and what does that, or should we continue to be pushing, for example, for things like free and fair elections, political institutions? We can probably do both, but there does seem to be a growing argument that we have not put enough attention on the economic side of things. And so while, of course, democracy and political liberalization are what we would like very much to see happen, that maybe there needs to be more attention on the economic side. I'd like to get each of your takes on this and use it as an opportunity if you have any concluding remarks, so we can wrap up in the next few minutes. So why don't we go in reverse order? I'll ask Alberto if you'd like to start us off.
Yeah, look, I think the economic dimension is essential, and this is a situation where there's an overlap between these two very different cases. In both Sudan and in Tunisia, as far as I understand, you have very high expectations, or you had very high expectations by the people, by the masses, that there would be a tangible improvement in their lives. And it hasn't happened. There's been real progress in kind of macro level type things, like Sudan, coming to agreements with the World Bank and the IMF. But, on the local level, on looking at the price of stuff, on the joblessness, unemployment, all of those things, those things all lag. So what does that do? That lack of economic progress contaminates or discredits a larger democratic process. It certainly discredits those who are in charge of economic and political portfolios. So you have this strange situation where the ones that are not in charge of that, like the army, can get away with murder because people are going to look at the actions of prime ministers or economic officials or whatever like that. So this is a dilemma. They are absolutely tied together.
Okay, Yasir?
Yes, I think the economic situation in Sudan was also really in a very severe kind of like projection. The IMF austerity measures has, although it has a good outcomes in the near future by like removing subsidies on gas and the subsidies on hard currency, but it has also affected the people in the average people in Sudan by rising prices and other lack of services. However, I think if there was a political institutions up and running or effective in solidifying civilian governments and also applying rule of law, accountability, and the people could actually see that this democratization is working for them, I think that would lead to move beyond the neck of the bottle. One of the things that I would like to conclude with is that I think the ball is in the field of the people, and I think with Hamdok's back in office, a wider civilian compromise and a bargain that could actually solidify those political institutions, and which could result in an elected government and elected parliament, would be a better outcome of the current crisis.
Terrific, thank you. And Chiraz, final remarks.
Yes, thank you. So actually in Tunisia, over the 10 years, there has been constant calls for an economic transition that should accompany the political transition. And there has been also calls that and a lot of experts and people in civil society have been saying that if we don't succeed in economic transition, it will challenge the political transition and it will impact the political transition. But it was not done for many reasons, but some points that we've had more than 10 governments. So there has been a lot of instability on the government level in order to formulate strategy and lasting strategy. And every government that comes starts from scratch. The second thing is that the bad management of the loans. There has been a lot of support and also loans that were used for management and not for development. And also the fact that there has been a lot of the inflation has gone very up, and also the shrinking of the middle class. And so you can see the impact of this failed economic transition on the lives of people. And so that's why I think we cannot separate the political and the economic achievements. They are both barometers to see that through which we can evaluate the success of any transition. So these are my final words, that they should go hand in hand. But in the case of Tunisia, it was not, and this is what we see today, is the consequences, the logical consequences of neglecting the economic field and the economic needed reforms.
Right. Well, I want to thank all of you for being here with us today. Just a plug, we at the Washington Institute have been exploring some of the issues that came out of this discussion today. So we have a series of papers that we started putting out a few months ago, looking at these questions of popular protest and democratic prospects, and trying to help the Biden administration in its approach to some of these issues across the region. So our viewers, if they're interested, can look at the website washingtoninstitute.org for that. But here I just want to say thank you very much to Chiraz Arbi and Yasir Zaidan and Alberto Fernandez. I think this has been a terrific discussion. And thank you all for taking the time and for your fantastic insights today. Take care, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.